So the panel lead for the day is Sara Du. She's the CEO and founder of Alloy. So Sara will be asking questions and keeping everybody on track, I imagine. And then the panel members are Roy Derks, engineering manager at Vandebron, Pragati Sharma, senior quality consultant at ThoughtWorks. I lost my thing here. Tanmai, am I saying that right? Tanmai Gopal? CEO and co-founder of Hasura, and Evan Weaver, CTO and co-founder of Fauna. All right, yeah, I think we might have had Tanmai get frozen here. Hopefully he's able to get back in, but I think with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna turn my camera off and let you all take it from here.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. So yeah, we're all GraphQL enthusiasts here. Thanks for introing everyone. I'd love to just do a round robin of everyone just giving an intro to how they got started with GraphQL and what exactly their company does in relation to GraphQL. So a bit of background on me. Alloy is this no-code API platform for any e-commerce merchant to be able to connect their apps and automate their work. And so we work very closely with the Shopify GraphQL API and a bunch of other apps in the ecosystem. And then, yeah, everyone else, I'd love to hear how you got started or what you do with relation to GraphQL. Probably alphabetical order.
Sending me.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Evan Weaver from Fauna. So Fauna has an interesting history. So I ran the backend software team at Twitter from 2008 to 2012. And Twitter was a big global API. There were lots of clients being built on Twitter's proprietary API. We struggled to scale the site. We ended up writing a lot of custom sharding solutions that used like traditional storage engines like DB, from MySQL, Redis, Memcache, that kind of thing. And I founded Fauna with some of the early team members from my team at Twitter. And we did consulting for a while and then moved into database development. And from the beginning of that project, from 2015 on, we wanted to build a data API, and it was serverless before serverless had a name. And we thought, it's silly that people spend all this time operationalizing databases. They have to manage infrastructure, which is idle most of the time. None of these problems are intrinsic to information science. They're just artifacts of, the failure to implement better tech. So we started building Fauna initially as a database because nobody cared about serverless anything. Once it got a name, it was a joke. But as we were maturing the tech and and innovating in the CS domain on the underlying architecture, we saw this ecosystem start to build adjacent to us. Vendors like Netlify, Vercel, Prisma, Hasura, they were starting to deliver applications in the way that we thought applications should be built, which is principally front-end composition. And if you're not composing on the front end, you're at least using serverless functions so that you're not managing infrastructure. And basically, product engineers could build something end-to-end that was complete, similar to kind of the transformation that Rails brought to people in the Agile era. And obviously, a key part of this transformation was GraphQL as a standard technology for composing these kind of API-driven services. So we added a native GraphQL API to Fauna, and kind of the rest was history from there. That really helped catalyze our growth and start us on this path to becoming what we hope will be the default persistence tier for serverless in the Jamstack.
That's awesome. Very cool. I think Pragati.
Hi everybody, I'm Pragati. So I'm associated with ThoughtWorks as a senior consultant. So my experience with GraphQL has started fairly off late. So we have a lot of clients that come up to us for all those digital transformation kind of stuff. So the first thing that we ask them is, what exactly is your problem statement? What is that one thing that you're going to solve for your customers or your end users? And most often than not, that one thing is making our systems more performant and making them kind of compatible with different devices, different users. We want to have a lot of data in like the minimum amount of time possible. So these are the kind of asks that they have from us. So potentially we usually do a proof of concepts and then we figure out what would be the right way to go ahead with. So if in case you want to focus more on security, we might ask you to do something else. But like I said, of late we have a lot of performance issues that are coming up with people and clients. So previous year only, we've actually started onboarding our clients over to GraphQL APIs. And the result out of that in terms of their customer onboarding has been really spectacular. And once one of the teams actually started onboarding their clients into this GraphQL concept, we gave a lot of cultivation sessions to other team members as well in our entire community. So what happened was that all the greenfield projects actually started using GraphQL API as their base. And that is how this community of GraphQL is actually growing in our consultancy. So ThoughtWorks is a tech consultancy. So that is how basically we're expanding our bubble of usage of GraphQL in our organization.
Interesting. Yeah. Quick question, like what's the breakdown between REST and Graph and others with the clients you work with?
So if I talk about my office location, we have about 30 odd clients with us right now, out of which most of them are using REST. And if I'll tell you the percentage, about 10% of them have got onboarded into GraphQL so far. So still, there's a long way to go for us to actually onboard the rest of the clients. But yeah, we are on our way.
Definitely. Nice. You guys are helping with the trend.
Mm-hmm.
And Roy, would love to hear about you.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Roy. I started using GraphQL, I think it was in 2016 at a hackathon, and then I met the people of GraphQL. So they were actually one of the first doing GraphQL in sort of a SaaS kind of solution. So that was really cool, and I actually, it was sort of love on first sight. And after that, I've been using GraphQL at some of the companies I founded myself. So I'm located in the Netherlands, and I've been starting some startups here, mostly peer-to-peer marketplaces where people could buy and sell stuff with each other. And after that, I've been using GraphQL mostly in the open source community. So I've been giving talks about GraphQL, really trying to boost the communities, trying to get people to adopt it, and also help companies adopting it. So an example, the city of Amsterdam, it's the city where I live. We implemented a lot of GraphQL on top of our existing REST APIs, and those are mostly REST APIs that were used with other people in the city or by companies in the city. So we actually saw it as a great way of building a smart layer on top of existing services, which are really nice for front-end developers because they could, of course, iterate quickly on new prototypes. So it's been almost 5 years already, but still, I think there's a bright future ahead.
Wow, looks like we have a pretty international panel. So I'm curious if GraphQL adoption varies between Netherlands, India, the US, whatnot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then finally, Tanmai, you're also based in India.
Yes, I am. I shuttle between SF and India and all of the places in the middle. So nice to see GraphQL kind of getting this worldwide adoption. Very interesting to see those trends. I'm Tanmai. I'm the CEO co-founder at Hasura. We started Hasura because we realized that there's kind of this bottleneck for modern application development, which is basically the glue between kind of database modernization that is happening, stuff like what Fauna is doing with, what Evan just talked about, and what modern application developers want to do, the way they want to consume data, right? And there's a bottleneck in the middle. There's this glue that people are kind of have for technology legacy and artifact reasons have built by hand. And so what we wanted to do was basically see if we can automate that process entirely, right? And what would it take to automate that process? And the very first version of Hasura that we built, supporting a particular set of databases, we actually invented our own version of GraphQL, which was very similar to GraphQL but in JSON. So imagine that there's an API that has type, read, fields, and then an array, a list of fields, as opposed to the GraphQL syntax, which is query and then you list out the fields, right? And so when we started doing that, and GraphQL was starting to become popular, and this was in 2018, we realized to kind of flip over and add support for GraphQL itself. And since then, it's kind of been amazing to see the community that's kind of gotten Hasura, right? So we were the fastest growing kind of GraphQL project in 2019 and 2020. It was really nice to kind of see that pull from developers to say that we really want to use GraphQL, but GraphQL is hard to use, right? It's a very nice API, but it's hard to kind of set up and use and operationalize, and it kind of almost in a way forces you to reinvent everything you operationally do when it comes to APIs, right? The way you build it, the way you consume it, the way you operate it, right? The way you debug performance with it, right? All of it changes, right? So there's a cost to it. And it's been really nice to see that, we've been able to kind of help people get on board with GraphQL and use it, and provide that kind of modern API to data that is increasingly kind of getting fragmented across sources, right? We're also living in this world where data is not just in one place. And that is also the rise of APIs itself, right? Is that it's not in one place. It's not one bank, one application talking to one DB in a bank, right? It's not that anymore. You ask a modern application developer where their source of truth data is, and they'll list out 5 services, right? They'll be like, well, my users are inside this authentication service, and my payments are here and behind this SaaS service, and my transactional data is here, my CMS data is here, right? My search data is here. And so GraphQL is kind of emerging as this way to deal with that complexity, right? That cognitive overload of like, my goodness, there's just too many APIs and they're not fitting together, and everybody has a different way of doing it, right? So you need kind of like this semantic model to put things together. And GraphQL is filling that void, right? So to me, especially, that more than the GraphQL technology itself, the politics of GraphQL and what it means for us as consumers of APIs and is extremely interesting, right? Because it's bringing that conversation that humans have to use data to build applications, and we need it to be easier. So excited to be here and discuss with you folks.
Yeah, that's a great point with the huge like mental model change. I'm curious, like for you and Evan, since you're founders building products, like what industries, like types of companies have been the fastest to adopt, and which ones have you seen like the hardest barriers for?
I think, especially GraphQL adoption spans every kind of industry. Some industries are slower moving overall, like, regulated industries like healthcare or finance. But I think, it's more insightful to talk about, the kind of adopters we see. Like, we see a lot of people building new apps, especially for us, because we're not an integration tool. We're at the bottom of the stack for new data. So we see a lot of people building new apps, especially consumer and SaaS. And then we see a lot of people augmenting their existing apps that are successful in the mid-market with serverless GraphQL capabilities. So there's a lot of people in kind of this transitional state where they use managed cloud, they use containers, and they're trying to get the productivity benefits of the new tech without giving up the investment or the maturity of the old tech.
Right.
I think, yeah, to add to what Evan said, it's been very interesting to kind of see the different kinds of companies that have we've seen kind of adopt GraphQL, and it's been across the board. People who are kind of setting up their first API stack because they can afford to kind of make an entirely new choice, right? People who are doing that. And then of course, kind of high technology firms where they have the kind of engineering bandwidth to absorb this complexity of building something new or dealing with something new, right? So obviously those kind of slightly more technically inclined companies, whether they're startups or larger firms or divisions inside larger firms. But what has been extremely interesting to me has been that some of our largest customers are Fortune 10, Fortune 100 customers who are very who wouldn't necessarily be known for like, yeah, that's the high tech company that uses all the latest tech, right? You wouldn't think of it like that, but what they have is they have this just tremendous amount of data and APIs, and there is a massive problem that they're facing, this innovation bottleneck that they're facing, where they're not able to build stuff fast enough because there's just too many people and technologies in the way of getting access to that data, right? For legitimate reasons, right? There's a security problem. It's not like you can extract all the healthcare data because some new person wants to build an app, right? Because it's legit. It's Medicare data of all of the US, right? So we've seen a tremendous amount of kind of adoption, success, and expansion inside these companies where you're unlocking existing data to build new applications, right? And it's kind of been a part of that, both the data and the API modernization that they need when they're kind of building stuff. So it's been fascinating to see that.
Right. It's very interesting to see some of these companies doing like half REST, half GraphQL, and slowly increasing their coverage. Yeah, with us, like the Shopify APIs very clearly moving towards GraphQL, but slowly. And then, yeah, Roy and Pragati, you guys are consultants, so you work, you're doing a lot of recommendations for your clients. You probably have a lot more influence. Oops, I think can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Sorry. You guys probably have a lot more influence over what your clients are choosing to do. So curious, like what you're seeing, like when someone you're, consulting for is looking for an API, like how are you convincing them to switch over to GraphQL? I guess Pragati first.
Sure. So I guess we do not want to overwhelm them by just saying, let's just grab whatever you have right now and let's start from the scratch. So they're just going to say, I guess we can just find another client for us. But what we do is we usually transform them from a REST system, a RESTful system, to a hybrid model. So for the first company that we actually did this for was a banking firm. And they had tightly coupled modules, because of which we could actually not even think of meddling with like certain modules and leaving rest of them as is. So what we thought was that the best thing for them would be to give them a flavor of the hybrid architecture and to tell them how is this actually favoring them in onboarding new clients for them and making their system more performant efficient. So what we did was that we potentially added a BFF layer, which is a backend for front-end layer in between. We consumed whatever REST APIs they were already consuming. And with the UI, we actually attached the GraphQL APIs. So in this entire model, we were actually using whatever there was in place in terms of their legacy systems. And at the same time, we actually gave them the advantages of using a GraphQL API. So this kind of slow transition actually helped them to understand the technology better, because the learning curve kind of became smoother, because they already know what REST is doing. And now we were teaching them what GraphQL can do for them. So yes, that is how we started off. But all the new projects that are coming up with a greenfield, so all of them are starting off from scratch. So it's better off for them to actually start with a GraphQL with a REST or a SOAP API. So that is exactly how these industries are working on. And talking about adoption, so I guess this is not very domain specific, because finance is something which is a lot of data, a lot of critical PII information is involved there. But they were still ready to take this leap of faith wherein they agreed to use a GraphQL because they were technology driven, because they had a lot of engineers who were actually ready to invest their time for this kind of digital transformation. And that is how we actually landed up moving them from a RESTful service to a GraphQL service.
Interesting. Appreciate that. And then Roy, yeah, what have you seen in the Netherlands?
Yeah, I've seen tons of things, but so one of the first talks I gave about GraphQL, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's actually called GraphQL will do to REST what JSON did to XML. And I think that sort of gives you an idea about things. People are still using XML, but most people prefer using JSON. So I think something similar is happening with GraphQL. So REST used to be a standard for a lot of people. You of course had SOAP and other kind of things, but I think REST is the go-to. And I think now you see it changing towards GraphQL. So you'll see the same sort of thing happening in people starting new projects, people migrating existing projects, people want to take a next leap with their product. Often there is there's the idea that REST is no longer sufficient. Well, it still often is, I think, but still you see people moving to GraphQL, because especially if you work with client-facing applications, you're going to build a client on top of it, like a mobile application or a web application. You're simply going to need GraphQL because it's really going to give you the flexibility in the dynamical kind of way that you need. So you see this happening a lot, and I think especially companies that don't use GraphQL will also find issues in hiring new people at some point. I think, especially in the front-end sector, you see people seeing GraphQL as a requirement in order to find a tech stack interesting. So you definitely see a move, and yeah, I'm eager to see what will happen next, because you already see sort of competitors for GraphQL popping up, like other kind of query languages for APIs that are more declarative than REST is. So yeah, I think it's good that the language keeps evolving and keeps adopting more and more companies.
I mean, with that's an interesting point. Like, what do you think are the biggest to GraphQL adoption?
I think mostly misuse, because GraphQL is great, but using just the query language for a server is not enough. If like the underlying technologies, if they're not sufficient, then you won't get the full benefit of GraphQL. So I think at some point, if people start doing this on massive scale, then somehow it will slow down the adoption.
There's a good question from one of the attendees. If anyone on this panel would like to speak about the security aspects of GraphQL versus REST, Tanmai, Evan, I'm sure you guys have a lot of opinions.
I'd love to take that from a security standpoint because well, I think the traditional ways of thinking about security don't work with GraphQL, or traditional infrastructure, traditional tooling that you had doesn't necessarily work, right? If you think about it from a complete like starting up, you're building your own REST API, so you're doing your own security inside the REST API, right? And so if you're building your own GraphQL API, you can build your own security inside the GraphQL API. But in practice, especially in large companies, there's a lot of security layers that are outside the REST API, right? It's not inside the REST API. You might have it inside a gateway, for example. You might have some authorization engine that's controlling access to certain endpoints, or that is making sure that only certain arguments can be passed back and forth and stuff like that. A lot of that ecosystem and of tooling does not work with GraphQL. And GraphQL also requires certain kind of slightly more creative ways of thinking about authorization, because fundamentally what GraphQL is doing is it's flipping the control of what data is returned to the client. So the implementers of the API don't control what data they're sending. Now, the impact that this has in reasoning about security is especially nuanced when it comes to something like performance, right? Because what happens is that if you are building a REST API that is returning a particular blob of data, you know all of the pieces and branches of data that you have to return. So if you know that, you can optimize that security check and that authorization check in a central place that works for all of the pieces of data that you're touching. Right. So if I know that I'm fetching authors and their articles and the author's orders on e-commerce or whatever, right? I know what those checks are across those pieces of data, and I can centralize them. This is harder to work with GraphQL because in GraphQL you can fetch any piece of data from wherever, right? And then that means that the authorization checks have to kind of be very closely tied to the data fetch checks that you have. Otherwise, what will happen at scale or in performance, when you'll run into these performance issues where you're doing a lot of redundant checks to validate kind of authorization things, and then you're also fetching data repeatedly, right? And that will effectively kill that system when you're building it internally. When you're using a tool that's kind of externalizing some of that security aspects, there is no GraphQL as a spec is silent on authorization practices around it, right? One of the ideas that we find fascinating that we've implemented is this idea of role-based schemas. So what that allows you to do is, like, if you have a role with REST APIs, what you can do is you can say, here's a consumer and here's the consumer API. Here's the merchant, here's the merchant API. Here's the public and here's the public API. And so you see different endpoints depending on kind of how you're logged in and what token you have. But generally what happens with GraphQL is that you'll have like, you'll just log in and you'll get the entire GraphQL schema, and you won't know what portions of the GraphQL API are queryable. And if you try to query them, maybe you'll just get a null at runtime. And so that can be confusing to people who are coming from a controlled endpoint-based experience to this vast GraphQL schema where everything seems to be queryable, but actually it's not when you try it out, right? And so introducing this, so we've introduced this idea of having kind of role-based schemas where you can say that the introspection and the validation is linked to the identity of the session, right? So that way you can have a consumer graph, you can have a merchant graph, you can have a public graph, and they can have overlaps, but they can also be kind of scoped in, right? So that you're not losing your mind by looking at this entire unified graph of the full API and losing. So there's a lot of new stuff to be done. There's some interesting ideas there, but it's definitely early days.
Sara, you're on mute right now.
I'll speak to Fona Security while we wait for Sara. So Fauna has a little bit of a different problem to solve. I agree with Tanmai. GraphQL is underspecified in the security domain, which is fine for the original internal composition use cases. But now we're composing web native services over the public internet from different vendors, and that's an extension of what GraphQL was designed for. Fona's use of GraphQL is also an extension in that it wasn't built to be a native query language for a database. So one of the ways we get around this is, you do a lot of configuration in Fauna at the FQL layer. So we offer GraphQL, which is easy to get started and standardized, but relatively limited, especially in its ability to mutate data, run complex transactions, that kind of thing. We also offer FQL, which is a document relational query language. It's also web native. It's also over JSON, that kind of thing. But the FQL schema lets you configure both, the collections and stuff that are exposed via GraphQL, but also what we call attribute-based access control, which is very similar to what Tanmai was talking about, where the data itself carries with it authentication checks. Everyone who queries the API has to identify via a secret key who they are, and that controls what data schema is exposed to them, so that we can enforce in a very deep way and in a very efficient way exactly what query results are returned, to make sure that it's fully safe from an application perspective. Because a lot of Fauna apps, they've mixed access patterns. Like the browser may be accessing the GraphQL API directly. Meanwhile, there's lambdas which are calling FQL to do more complex work. Sometimes the browser calls the lambda. There might be middleware that's calling FQL behind the scenes. So we need to make sure that the security is pervasive, which means you have to push it all the way down to the as close to the data as you possibly can.
That's also, hopefully my audio is good now. Biggest question that people have is, when would you all recommend not using GraphQL? Like, when is the investment not worth it? Any hot takes for why this is not a good question? Maybe Pragati, you want to go first?
Take a stab at that. So primarily as a consultancy, I can talk on behalf. Exactly, we tackle the situation wherein somebody is not ready to get onboarded, or if that even doesn't make sense for them to shift from whatever they're using right now to a GraphQL, right? So every company has a different pain point or a different problem statement. It would be an overkill for just asking them to switch technologies if their pain point is extremely different. If they want to add new features, we won't ask them to change their tech. If they're looking at something else, which changing of tech stack would help them enable, that is only when we actually recommend them going from a system that is already in place to going into a more diverse system, which GraphQL brings in. So if there is a company which is already using a particular tech and they come up to us and they ask us that, okay, let me just make my system more secure, or just let me add more user base in terms of having my analytics in place, those are those particular cases wherein we would not ask them to change a particular API base. At the same time, if the need be that we think that this is the right way for them to go, as I mentioned earlier, it's better for us to gradually onboard them into a hybrid system by not scrapping off all the APIs that they have been using already, which are REST or SOAP APIs. And then, of course, making that learning curve smooth for them as well, because like we discussed, it's not very easy for us to actually get onboarded into GraphQL because it's all schema validation based. You're not creating different endpoints. You just have like a supercharged endpoint, and whatever query mutations you'll make, it will just behave as is, because we're shifting the capabilities and the power from our server to our client. So that is when we actually need to realize that GraphQL should not be an overkill for our projects, that when it is not needed, when it is not solving a problem statement, we should not actually recommend our clients to go forward with it. So yeah, that is usually how we actually tackle this.
Gotcha. And then, yeah, Roy, what about for you and your clients? Has there been any times where you recommended they don't go forward with GraphQL?
Yes, actually, a couple of times. So I think one thing GraphQL is doing very good if you want to iterate a lot in your front end, or maybe you have multiple front ends and multiple use cases per endpoint, then it's a great language to use for your APIs. But yeah, if you just have one API and you have a backend team that's really working on it, and you're creating those backend for front ends, and you don't really need GraphQL because everything is static and you can make your REST APIs in such a way that you don't do under or overloading, then yeah, that's something that would be great. I also think for machine-to-machine communication, often REST is good because microservices don't really need to talk GraphQL with each other, but they could just exchange the REST contracts. So there's multiple ways you cannot use GraphQL. But I think especially for a client-facing application that's dynamic, maybe you have multiple applications or you want to iterate a lot, then GraphQL is really the best language for you.
Yeah. And then for Evan and Tanmai, same question, but also when people are building new GraphQL services with you guys, like what are some anti-patterns they should watch out for?
I mean, we're in a unique position to talk about this because we offer two APIs to the same underlying infrastructure, and everyone adopting Fauna, is adopting it as much for the that architecture, that operational simplicity, the global ubiquitous API as for the specific query language. So most people, they're familiar with GraphQL, so they start there. But as their needs mature, we see them leap into either fully FQL or a hybrid model, where they use some GraphQL and some FQL, like I mentioned before. And one of the things that behooves us to invest in going forward is to make these interfaces closer together, so that when you're using GraphQL, you can incrementally adopt FQL when the GraphQL spec doesn't meet your needs. And you don't have that kind of impedance mismatch or mental leap as you switch between these two paradigms. And this is possible for us because part of the reason we implemented GraphQL was we saw a bunch of our users in the early days building GraphQL adapters for Fauna because the data model was essentially the same.
Yeah, I'd heavy plus ones to everything that was said, and I think there's I think GraphQL itself, when we think about like the use case of GraphQL, right? There's like what Evan alluded to earlier as well. It was originally designed for a very specific front-end use case, which was this problem of saying that the front-end applications and developers are doing a lot of tedious and repetitive work when it comes to integrating APIs. And you'll notice constructs in GraphQL around fragments and around type safety that actually automate a lot of work for GraphQL developers. In fact, the folks at Facebook, when they were releasing GraphQL, they were very afraid that GraphQL would never pick up because for them, GraphQL is invisible. They don't actually have like the way we think of a GraphQL API and the schema. They don't actually use that. It's just built into their tooling, right? They write a UI component, you specify a data requirement, and when that UI component comes together, all of the pieces of the query are automatically merged, deduped, right? All of that work happens. Now, this tooling is possible because of the GraphQL specification. So that's what it was originally intended for. Now, when we think about GraphQL adoption today, right, we still see obviously there's a tremendous amount of benefit for the front-end developers, but a very large amount of that GraphQL benefit is not coming from the type safety and the fragment-based advanced tooling that GraphQL as a specification has. It's actually coming from a secondary use case of GraphQL, which is the ease of API exploration. It's that is powering, very similar to kind of, when, for example, when Postman itself introduced collections, right? And people were like, wow, I can see my APIs in one place, right? GraphQL had a similar impact on people when they were like, I can finally see all my APIs in one place so I can use it, right? And that is a huge driving force for people who want to consume GraphQL. So now when you think about where to use GraphQL and where to not use GraphQL, there's two sort of answers that emerge. Are you building a front-end heavy application, right? And you need to iterate fast on the front end. You need to build things quickly on the front end. You have JSON-ish data, right? GraphQL is a great fit. You have binary data, file data, video data. GraphQL is not a good fit. You're just using whatever other protocols you were using. Whether it's just underlying UDP or whether it's a different protocol on HTTP or TCP or whatever, right? So that's fine. The other place where GraphQL does not find a good fit was like what Roy was saying, was you have microservice to microservice communication, because those developers are like, nah, gRPC is fine. Like if you're moving away from REST, let's move to gRPC. I don't know about this whole GraphQL thing. I'm not sure about it, right? I don't need it necessarily. And in those cases, there is still a benefit of GraphQL if the consumers of these APIs and the people building those services are facing an API exploration problem, right? We're thinking about the fact that there is too many APIs. I need to be able to navigate these APIs. So there, GraphQL potentially has an entry point again and helps you kind of say that, well, it's worth investing in GraphQL because the cognitive overload of dealing with the number of APIs and the graphiness and the relationships between these APIs is complicated. And so I would say that those are kind of like, the platform API story and the client API story, right? And those are two places where it fits in well. Everywhere else, it's touch and go. So it's up to you to decide. But I would say those are, for me, that have emerged as kind of absolute things. A quick small point that I'd like to add here is a small plug is a specification we've been working on to help transform a GraphQL endpoint into an idiomatic REST endpoint. So basically what that allows for you to do is say that I'm only going to invest in this GraphQL API, but I'm not going to be locked into it, because tomorrow when I need a REST endpoint, I can go to the GraphQL query, make like a perfect GraphQL query, template the variables out, and then convert that into a REST endpoint. So here you're kind of getting benefits of both. You're getting that benefit of GraphQL as a part of the API lifecycle to explore the API, learn about the API, but in production, you're getting an idiomatic REST endpoint. So that means you don't have to deal with the weirdness of GraphQL errors. That means you don't have to modify your tooling. You can even use your REST API security tooling, your proxies, whatever you have. And so I think technologies like that will help us do GraphQL and REST, because I have a strong suspicion that I don't think REST is going anywhere. It's going away anytime soon, right? It's going to be around. It's going to be pervasive, and for a lot of people, it's going to be a challenge to maintain both GraphQL and REST. And we need solutions to keep them side by side in the same way together.
Totally, that's a great point, great prediction, because I do see a lot of public-facing API docs just having both. And then, yeah, kind of going off that point, like what types of like tooling do you guys think would help with GraphQL adoption, or people just getting started with creating that first GraphQL endpoint or migrating? I guess, Evan, since you're building a product, I'm curious what features and tools you're investing in.
I mean, we're focused a lot on the bleeding edge of this stack. And this is kind of day one for this development stack. And from my perspective, about every 10 years, we get a revolution in development methodology, and we get a host of infrastructure and dev tool services along with it. It's like in the 90s, we had LAMP, and then in the O's, we had Rails and J2EE and Django. In the 10s, we had the mean stack. Each of these carried a database with them in particular. Fauna is the database for the serverless generation. But that means, the tooling is immature. It's not, I won't go so far as to say it's a worse is better value proposition, because it's a better is better value prop, but it's definitely immature. And that means, although the day one components of the stack are there, you can build an end-to-end application which is complete. All the management stuff is yet to be sorted out. So things like security tooling, performance monitoring,
caching.
Yeah, caching, discovery beyond a single API, like everything that you would expect to find in a legacy environment, managed cloud or what have you, has to be rebuilt for a serverless API-driven world. So I think that's where a lot of investment is going to go into in the future. Like there's not, I would say, there's not a GraphQL-friendly, serverless-friendly data warehouse. Someone's going to do it. But that's a day two concern compared to just getting the app out the door or augmenting the existing technology with new tech.
Great points for any entrepreneurs in the room. Definitely a lot of areas to in. And then, yeah, for Roy and Pragati, like what types of tools are you guys using when you're helping set those APIs up, or is it completely in-house? Roy?
Go first.
Now you might start if you want.
Sorry, I just heard an echo.
Oh, sorry, you might start if you want.
Okay. Okay. So for us, so since I work as a QA, right? So for us, if I talk about adoption in terms of QAs versus devs, I guess there's a huge difference, because setting up the infrastructure, setting that and operationalizing the entire GraphQL bit is heck of a task. But when it comes into the testing cycle, for us, I guess it's more of a QA mindset shift than basically a tool shift. Because primarily what we're doing is we're making a post call and we have a very different kind of request body. That's it. So if I talk about the QA journey in terms of adoption of a tooling technique when it comes to testing a GraphQL API versus a REST API or the conventional methods for that matter, the entire learning experience had been quite smooth, because what we're doing is, so we've actually worked around Rest Assured, Postman, beta versions, everything. We've tried using all these things for actually testing our GraphQL APIs. And not even once did we ever feel that we are testing something different. What was different, in fact, was how exactly are you making those validations? Now, all those conventional validations, we were checking those response codes, response methods, everything, HTTP methods, all of them are gone, because that doesn't hold any significance for you now. What is most significant is how you're actually making those schema validations. Whatever you're putting in your request, is it the same data that your response is sending you, or are you still overfetching or underfetching? So that is the main question that arises for us. The other thing is that apart from that, you have to take care of the ordering bit, the exact attributes that are getting returned from your request to your response. So all those things that a client is potentially doing for you rather than your server. In terms of that, I guess tooling is not that great a factor, as is how you are actually transferring that kind of QA mindset to your community. So that, in my sense, holds more importance than basically any kind of tool adoption.
And Roy?
Yeah, I agree with what Evan said. Like, a lot of tooling isn't there. And that's a question people ask, because if people are used to working with REST and they going to try and use all sorts of HTTP tooling that they already have, because yeah, in theory it's still a post request, but yeah, a lot of things are going over HTTP, but people still think they can use those tools, and in a certain manner you can. Yeah, but there's a lot of new things to discover, and one of the things I do really like about GraphQL, if you look at like API exploration, like a lot of the tooling that used to be external, like Swagger or OpenAPI, is now internal. So GraphQL already has these kind of things, like for schema validation, it's already in the specification for GraphQL. So a lot of stuff is already there, but still a lot of tooling needs to be created. And I think what you see right now with a lot of companies like getting investments to build those kind of tools. So I think there's definitely a movement going forward and really maturing GraphQL, maturing the whole ecosystem around it. And then it would be interesting, as Evan said, like what will be the next wave, maybe in a couple of years or maybe more.
We're just starting this one. Give us some time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue into, the last 15 minutes I do spend on the future of GraphQL, which is the topic of this. So Evan, what are your predictions for this next 10-year wave?
I mean, I think GraphQL is going to become ubiquitous as the API access language. It's not a query language, and it never will be. But in terms of the API standard and delivering that core value proposition of decoupling the front end and the background, it's absolutely delivering, and we're going to be using it for decades hence. I think what's most interesting to me is how the operational architecture of the tools which are being built for this new world evolves along with it, because there's kind of a complementary shift that we didn't have before. Like Mongo, it was still a primary, secondary replicated system. It wasn't operationally different than Postgres or even MySQL from the 90s. But people who are composing APIs have different expectations for how they treat their infrastructure. They expect it to be, physically agnostic, and have no need or even insight into the underlying infrastructure, no need to manage capacity, locality, consistency, that kind of thing. And that means when you deliver GraphQL tooling, it has to be for a REST-like world, a web native, globally available world. And that means we have to have architectural innovation along with it. And I think that is going to bring a lot of productivity to application development that is complementary to the flexibility of the interface itself.
Interesting. Yeah, and then Tanmai, what are your thoughts?
I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think I think what GraphQL has definitely hit a nerve with is the problem, which is the problem of API exploration and the problem of integrating complex APIs and API explosion and data explosion. How GraphQL will evolve to keep up with it, I think is going to be the most important thing, right? One of the things with REST is that nobody actually does REST, because the actual HATOS implementation spec is nobody uses that, right? It's like most APIs just have get and post, and it's very few APIs will be like idiomatically perfect REST, right? And that allowed REST to kind of become really popular. Now GraphQL is a tighter specification and doesn't allow for that kind of flexibility. that REST has, right? And that is a problem for its future, right? And in the sense, people like building things when it's flexible. People like building things when it's like, I don't care. I'm just going to do whatever it takes to get my job done. And those technologies really take off, right? Sometimes it's not about anything else. And so when I think about the future of GraphQL, I think in line with kind of what Evan said, I think because it's solving such a big problem that people have, I think the pattern that is going to repeat from history is probably going to be the SQL pattern. And what I mean by that is technically, right? Instead of having this conversation about GraphQL, we could be talking about SQL. Why aren't we using SQL as an API? Why don't clients post a SQL query? And then why don't you respond in the set, right? A list of arrays, which is SQL. Why don't you build web servers that speak SQL, right? And there's technical pros and cons, but I think the reason for it that's operationally actually running and executing a high quality SQL server is hard. And the only people who decided to take that work up were database servers. I think a similar thing is going to happen with GraphQL, where vendors that realize that they have a tremendous amount of data to share in a nice way are going to bridge that gap and provide GraphQL as a service that people are going to use and consume. And I think that is going to be a future for GraphQL that'll be easy for people to move into, where it's a very nice API for humans to use, not necessarily the best thing for humans to build, because it's operationally much more complex than REST is. And technology tends to simplify, technology doesn't tend to get complicated, right? Like today building a REST API is like, today building a GraphQL API is like, I don't have a hand motion for it. It's complicated. So that's kind of my take on GraphQL. That makes sense.
Really interesting. Huh. Yeah, Pragati, what are your thoughts there on the future of adoption?
What I believe is that most of the organizations, what they're looking for is device agnostic, platform agnostic solutions. So what they want to just switch their application from what they had previously as desktop applications to mobile applications. For that to happen, and if in case they want that to happen, they would want to have like quicker text solutions. So which GraphQL is definitely the answer. So if we look at the span, so we've seen a lot of companies have already moved in, but now conventional forums like finance, healthcare, all of them are also moving into a more mobile-based, smaller screen resolution, responsive screens, because of which they would need to have like faster solutions, for which GraphQL is again the answer for them. The other thing is that when we talk about performance, security, all these NFRs, potentially GraphQL can actually, if I look at the future, not today, maybe it's not that great, but in the near future, maybe after 5-6 years down the lane, when we'll again have a conversation of future of GraphQL, we'll be talking about how successfully it has actually catered to all those NFR issues that were earlier existing in this format. So yeah, what I think is that since the industry is moving into smaller screen resolution, more responsiveness, quicker feedbacks, more performant efficiency, so GraphQL is the way for it.
Point. Yeah, that's an interesting trend to think of. And Roy, what are your final thoughts there?
Yeah, overall, I think I agree with the other panelists. I think GraphQL certainly has a future, and you see people more and more adopting GraphQL instead of other technologies. And yeah, especially if you start greenfield, like why would you start with REST if there are new technologies, new standards being developed? And I think the more and more companies that are being created right now, or products created right now, that have GraphQL as a standard, but also set a standard for new products arising. But yeah, still, it's interesting to see what the future will bring, especially around the things we discussed, like tooling or more future-proof scenarios. And also, you see companies like Evan said, like also creating other sites of query languages that are similar or trying to be similar. So I think a lot can move in the future.
And then, yeah, another popular question asked by attendees has been like, how do you get started? What are some resources? So opportunity to plug yourselves and also kind of share like how you got started and dove into the GraphQL. So we'd love to just hear everyone's thoughts on where people can get started.
We've been putting together a bunch of nice resources at hasura.io/learn. Do check that out. Entirely open source courses, use a variety of technologies, and a great way to kind of understand, even if you know nothing about GraphQL, the tutorials are between 30 minutes to 2 hours long. and should take you through kind of a bunch of the key features there. So that might be a nice place to get started.
There are a variety of tutorials on our site too, specific to GraphQL and Fauna, and you can sign up for a free forever database without a credit card and just go nuts exploring what serverless GraphQL can give you.
And then what do you guys typically recommend for clients, Pragati?
So we typically recommend them to have sessions from us. That is what we do usually. But from where we learn is usually our community. So we have a lot of stronger community wherein we have different sessions which are value-oriented sessions. So they are called vodka sessions, value-oriented conversations for QAs. So we do that. That is where we learn about these interesting stuff. And then we kind of propagate this entire thing to our clients. And then that is how they learn. We share the videos with them because all of them are like open source. They're available on YouTube and stuff. So yeah. So that is pretty much our starting point from where we start.
Awesome. Yeah, any like influencers in the space or resources you follow, Roy?
Yeah, actually, it was something I'm maybe a bit old school with that, but I also refer people to read documentation. So GraphQL.org is a great source for everything related to GraphQL. I think Tanmai mentioned this website. If you want to start with Hasura, that's a great source. If you want to look at Fauna, go to their documentation. I think that's also a good start. And if you want to find those things all combined, I always like the website How to GraphQL, because it's like the main source of information for basically all sort of GraphQL stacks you can imagine.
Cool. And yeah, I guess last question for everyone. What's been the best example of GraphQL documentation you've seen with like any public APIs or any favorite ones you guys have? Oh, I think you're muted, Tanmai.
That's a hard one. I was kind of sucking in my breath and thinking about the documentation. I really like the direction that the OneGraph folks have been taking in creating a tool around documenting. There's some very interesting kind of ways to do that. It's kind of like a data dictionary combined with GraphQL API. So I really like that idea, and there's an open source project around it too.
Nice.
As far as like conceptual overviews go, I think the GraphQL.org documentation that Lee, the inventor of GraphQL, initially set up is still the best. It gives you a very clean and explorable overview of the core principles and the value of GraphQL.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess my question was actually more targeted towards like examples of great APIs you've seen. Like for me, I just think of Shopify, but curious like which companies have done it best. Any thoughts, Roy?
Yeah, I think like in terms of documentation or more like tooling, because most they're like two standard GraphQL explorers. So you have GraphQL and the one made by Prisma initially, I think. Yeah, so most companies use those, and I think it's interesting to see how they try and structure those things in a way that's understandable.
Awesome. Cool. Any last thoughts, Pragati?
The documentation that I think is like the best one that I have used is the Apollo GraphQL documentation. It has this entire verbose explanation of how to use that, how to actually connect that with the Apollo servers, how would it render on the UI and stuff. So from testing perspective as well, it actually gives you the in-memory bit, and then you can actually very well use your Apollo server with your UI, and you're good to go. You're good to make your test cases up and running.
Awesome. Yeah, big fan of Apollo. Great. Does anyone have any like last thoughts? I think we pretty much covered all of the questions people had. Hopefully you guys can all drop your emails down below or links and make sure everyone can get the resources you mentioned. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for taking the time. Everyone here is quite the influencer, so drop your Twitters, whatever, and have the attendees follow you for future resources.
Thanks, Sara.
All right.
Thanks, Sara.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, this was awesome. I know I really enjoyed it. So thanks so much for you all coming in and talking about the future of GraphQL. I think it was so cool how you took questions, worked them into the panel from the chat. So Sara, awesome job weaving those in, and to everybody on the panel that answered, really, really fantastic job. All right, I mean, we have another minute or so here before we technically have to leave. I don't know if you want to hop off, but I think there were, I think, a handful of questions in Slido that I saw. I think we might have covered some of them. But yeah, if there's, Sara, I'm happy to defer to you if you want to pull any of these to the panel.
Yeah, it looks like we covered the pain points for people. There's one last question if anyone wants to respond to the new architectural patterns, if anyone has thoughts on that.
So that question speaks to something we've been promoting that we call client-server architecture, which, in the 90s you had rich applications running on the desktop talking over a LAN to a database, which was like literally in the closet. But that model has, it went away with web, with REST. You got the 3-tier architecture, and you had dumb clients just making HTTP requests. But it's back now, and GraphQL has partly brought it back because clients can be smart. We have very robust browsers with computation power. We have mobile apps. They're globally distributed. They're making smart decisions about the business functionality on the client side. I think that pattern is going to become pervasive, again, in a transitional way, because not everyone can switch at once. But we'll start to see the return of those really rich client-side applications that compose APIs in very dynamic and flexible ways.
For the super comprehensive response. Any last questions from attendees? Last chance to just throw stuff in the chat. Someone asked, what about the graph? If anyone has a response to that.
Tanmai?
I have nothing to say. Everything's about the graph.
We love the
graph. Say?
Awesome. Yeah, this feels like as good a place as any to wrap things up. So again, thank you all for coming on and talking. Really, really appreciate it. Hope everyone that was at the session really having a good time at Postman Galaxy. We do have a bit of a break coming up, so feel free to go to the expo. We have a number of sponsors offering demos, challenges, giveaways. So feel free to stop by there. Plenty of awesome things coming up, and I would definitely check out the keynote with Dr. Ochoa. I am very much looking forward to that myself, and I think that's all for now. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.